Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Tango Banter, episode number 51. I am Yelizaveta, and I am freshly back from the Puerto Vallarta Tango Festival, where I had the opportunity to meet many of you face to face. And it was just so cool in so many ways. I got to meet some of you who know me through my podcast, and many of you who know me through Earth Virtual Milonga, including some people who were an essential part of Earth Virtual Milonga for a long time and were working with me throughout the 2 years that I was running it here from LA. And it was such an amazing experience to be able to finally put the names and the faces to bodies and spend some time with you. So it was a real treat. Now, this festival was a mixed bag, I would say, and I had a lot of interesting experiences, both positive and negative. And I'm going to be reflecting on those over the next few weeks. And today I wanted to start off my reflection thinking about the topic that already has come up before in our private Facebook group, and that is the topic of taxi dancing. Taxi dancing was a big part of this festival. There were many professional dancers who were official taxi dancers, and I got to observe firsthand the impact that the presence of taxi dancers at a festival has on the energy and the culture of the milonga. So in the past, when we had a conversation inside our private Facebook group on this topic, I at the time had a kind of a limited experience with taxi dancing, mostly derived from my experience in Buenos Aires a few years ago, where I got to meet some of the professional dancers who taxi dance. But this time I got to see firsthand how it works and what effect it has on the dancers at the milonga. So I wanted to revive this topic and add to the conversation. Those of you who were at the festival, who perhaps had more experience with taxi dancers there, I invite you to reach out to me and share your insights. And also, if you are not part of my private Facebook group and would like to continue conversing on these topics, then go ahead and click on the link in the show notes, and I would love to add you to the group discussions. I have a live chat that happens every Friday, and would love to have you participate. So let me just first explain how taxi dancing works for those of you who are new to the concept. Basically, it means that you hire a dancer to dance with you. So most of the time, it's a professional dancer of a higher level. They might be also a teacher. And typically in the past, I've seen it happen sort of behind closed doors, where it happens ahead of time, where a teacher sets it up with a particular client, and there's an exchange of monetary compensation. And then at a milonga, the taxi dancer dances with their client for a particular amount of tandas or a particular amount of time. Sometimes it's by the hour, sometimes it's by the number of tandas. It depends on the setup. I heard recently that there was another tango event, a marathon, where taxi dancing was an official part of the marathon, and I heard a lot of really positive feedback on how it really helped to, let's say, level the playing field and allowed a lot of the dancers who wouldn't necessarily typically get a chance to dance with professional dancers, give them a chance to dance with them. So at the Puerto Vallarta Tango Festival, this was also the case, that there was a table dedicated to taxi dancers. They had a big sign, and I got to see firsthand how it all works. And so the way it went down at this particular event is that if you wanted to dance with one of the taxi dancers, you would go to the front desk and you would pay $5 for a tanda, and they would give you a little token that was a yellow token in the shape of a heart. And whenever you wanted to hire one of the dancers, you would go to the table and you would give your token, and then you would choose the dancer that you wanted to dance with. And you could have as many tandas as you wanted. So many people that I observed taking advantage of this service, they bought multiple tokens many times throughout the night, and they did it several days in a row. So there was no limit to how much you could buy. At first, it was a little strange. When we first got there, a couple of my friends bought several tokens, and they felt very strange about it. And right away, the comment was that it was so awkward to be walking up to a table full of these taxi dancers and having this process of exchange. It felt sort of a little bit vulnerable, a little bit embarrassing, and my friends were reluctant to do it the first night because it just felt sort of awkward. But as the festival progressed, it seemed like everybody sort of got on board and got used to the process, and I saw mostly women going up to that table a lot. So much so that there were not enough taxi dancers to cover the demand. It seemed like certain dancers in particular were very popular, and a lot of the women really wanted to dance with them as much as possible. So there are a few things that I observed that this created, sort of a different energy, I would call it, in the milonga. And on the one hand, it was really wonderful to see women getting to dance with really advanced dancers, and a lot of times it was older women who might otherwise be sitting out the tandas. So it was a great experience for me to watch that there's so much joy and so much happiness on the dance floor, because so many of these women got to dance with these incredible dancers. However, it also felt like it created more division between dancers, between the haves and have-nots, because there were still a lot of women who did not participate in hiring the tango dancers. And even though I believe there was probably a dozen or so taxi dancers and they were dancing all the time, they hardly ever sat, especially on Saturday. It still was the case that there were a lot of women sitting. So the gender imbalance that I think taxi dancing is supposed to help with didn't really seem to be alleviated. It seemed like there were still a lot of women sitting and waiting to be asked. It also seemed like the people who were on board with taxi dancing, they were the ones who were consistently hiring the taxi dancers. And then there was other people who either they didn't know how to do it, or they just weren't familiar with the concept, or they were embarrassed or uncomfortable with it. So there was this interesting bifurcation in energy. On the one hand, there were a lot of really ecstatic women who were just having the time of their life. And at the same time, there were other women who were still sitting and waiting and not getting the dances that they wanted. And that extreme difference was sort of even more acute than what I experience regularly. On a regular basis, the gender imbalance is sort of the constant aspect of tango and is a constant topic of conversation and wanting to find some sort of solution to that. But here it felt even more acute because now it wasn't just that it was between young dancers who are getting all the dances and older dancers who are not. Now even among the older dancers who might not generally get the dances that they desire, within that group there was a lot of division, and certain people were extremely happy and very satisfied, and other people were really dissatisfied and really upset. And with even the presence of taxi dancers and the energy of the milonga being sort of very friendly, and there seemed to be a lot of enthusiasm, I was still meeting people who said that they were not getting any dances at all. There was a young woman who was actually a fairly good dancer herself, said that she did not get any dances at all one night, and she sat for 2 hours and was not able to really enjoy herself. So that's one interesting aspect that I noticed, that even though the presence of taxi dancers seems to solve a layer of the issue, it doesn't necessarily solve all of the problems that come from the gender imbalance and the difficulties that certain dancers have with getting dances. But also, it just seemed like it wasn't enough. The demand was so high, and there was this almost like a feverish energy that once certain dancers got a taste of what they could have, they just wanted more and more and more. And it seemed like there could have been double the amount of taxi dancers, and it would still not be enough to cover the demand. Now, the other aspect that was interesting to observe for me is that the taxi dancers really became a different group of dancers that did not interact with other people unless it was through this transaction. So it created division in a different way. They sat all together behind a table. They talked amongst each other, and there was a lot of camaraderie among them. And then they interacted with people who were paying for the tandas. But they did not interact or connect necessarily with dancers outside of that. So when there's so much conversation in tango about the cliquishness of tango and how to deal with that, it definitely felt like this was a different form of a clique that was created, because they did not really have an incentive to interact with people that were not paying them. So overall, now we had even more different types of groupings within the milonga that I observed. On the one hand, you had just the social dancers who are just going through the motions of cabeceo and doing the dance the traditional way. Then within that, you had a group of women mostly who were interacting a lot with the taxi dancers, who were their own little group, and they did not interact very much with dancers outside of their own circle. And then on top of that, you had the professional dancers, the teachers, who were not taxi dancers, who sat in their own little corner, and like so many other teaching groups, they did not interact with the commoners, let's say, and they chose to just sit and converse with each other, or maybe they danced amongst themselves, or they maybe danced with some of the organizers, or some of the special people. But there was not really a bridge between these groups, the taxi dancers and the professional dancers, and everyone else. So I think it was a strange thing to observe, because of course the taxi dancing model is an appropriate model to test out, because a lot of the dancers who come to festivals, they want to get the best experience possible, and why not open up the possibility that you can bypass the game of cabeceo and trying to get into good graces of certain social dancers, and just pay and get what you want. I have to say also, as a DJ, observing this was interesting, because at certain points throughout my set, I was approached by dancers who were really eager to hear particular tandas that they could dance with the taxi dancers. So I had a woman come up to me and ask me and request that I play a particular tanda, because she had already danced a particular tanda with this taxi dancer, but now she really wanted to make sure she danced this other tanda with him. And she was very adamant that I really needed to make this happen for her. So again, I felt it was kind of unusual, and there was a little bit of this feverishness in her, just this like, I need more, I need to make sure I get more. And that's something that I feel is like, opening up a Pandora's box in a way. Because once some of these dancers got a taste, as I said, they just want more and more and more. So now, when it comes to actually thinking about the taxi dancers themselves and how they feel about the whole process, I was asking around the dancers who got to dance with these taxi dancers. I was just kind of getting a feel for how they're thinking about it and how they feel about the process. And at least a couple of people reported that they said that they really disliked the whole process, and they actually they use the word hate. They hate the process. That fear that this feels sort of like a form of prostitution, let's say, that is a real experience, that does feel that way to some of them, and they don't like, and they don't want to do it, and they kind of feel that they sort of have to endure it. And that aspect of it is also sort of an interesting power dynamic, because whereas typically it is the men who are initiators and in some ways hold the power of the dance, because they're the ones who are approaching or initiating the cabeceo. In this case, the power dynamic is shifted, and it's the women who not only are initiating, but they're sort of feeling entitled because they have that token, and the taxi dancer can't say no. And that was, yeah, it's interesting how that shifts the energy once again. And the fact that some of the taxi dancers don't like the process kind of casts a different light on the whole arrangement. And I do think that it's something that should be considered when you're facing the prospect of dancing with somebody who is a taxi dancer. Now, on the other hand, I also talked to another woman who hired the taxi dancer for a tanda, and the taxi dancer was so blown away by this dancer and had such a good time with her that he actually gave her the token back, and sort of as a sign that she didn't need to pay, that he wanted to dance with her regardless of the payment. And so again, there's that, sort of extreme difference between experiences, and sometimes it's a very positive experience and sometimes it's not. So for those of you who have this trepidation or reluctance to support taxi dancing because you feel it's somewhat exploitative, or it reminds you of a process of hiring a prostitute, like, that is real. And there are taxi dancers who feel that way and they don't like it and they don't want to have to do it. Now, why they're doing it, perhaps they are doing it for financial gain directly, or perhaps they're doing it because they get to attend a festival that way as a taxi dancer without having to pay, or maybe that's a way for them to build their clientele as teachers. But they're not necessarily doing it out of the goodness of their heart because they really enjoy sharing tango and they enjoy connecting with people. They are really doing it because they somehow have to, or feel they have to. And the other thing that I didn't really get a sense of is how much do they actually get to keep from the payment that the dancers were paying at the front desk. So it was $5 a tanda, and it's not clear whether each dancer actually gets to keep the full $5 that was charged, or whether they get to keep a percentage. And when you buy the token, you're not necessarily, you don't know who you're going to dance with. You just buy the token. And so later, you give the token to the taxi dancer. And I guess they tally up how many tokens each dancer got at the end. But that's another interesting question I have. So if some of you got to experience this and maybe you have a little bit of insight into the process, share with me, because it would be interesting to find out. So I guess I want to finish talking about this topic by suggesting some things that I would do differently, because it does seem like it's a good thing to investigate and to experiment with in our culture. But there's a lot of side effects, unforeseen side effects, that this structure brings, and I think it should be considered, because just having taxi dancers at a festival or a marathon doesn't necessarily solve ultimately the gender imbalance issue, which was still pretty pronounced. And I remember dancing with a good friend of mine, a seasoned long-time milonguero from another city, and he pointed out that at one point he looked out and he said, look at all these women sitting out. They're not getting the dances. And there were quite a few. And it was interesting too, because there were taxi dancers and there were quite a few dual role dancers, including myself. I danced 90% of the time with women, and it was somewhat of a goal of mine, an intention of mine, to really promote this idea and the vision of women dancing with women. And I saw quite a few other women who mostly danced with women. So with all of that, it was still quite visibly imbalanced, and a lot of women still sat out. And I also know, I'm not suggesting that it's all on everybody else to make sure that, these women get the dances. Some of it is on the individual dancers. Maybe they're not pursuing, or they're not putting themselves out enough, or they are, somehow not pushing for it, not being proactive, and that definitely is a possibility as well. But nonetheless, the issues remain, that the gender imbalance is a real thing in tango. And so taxi dancing, I think, is a good thing to try out. But I do feel like the model of having it as a visible table at a milonga where people come and they submit a token, I think it's not as classy as it could be. If I'm honest, I feel if I were to do it differently, I would have it more sort of in the background, so that you can go and you can reserve a particular dancer, but that it's done sort of outside of that main space, and that when the time comes for the dance to happen, that it is the taxi dancer who comes and cabeceos the client, the dancer they're going to dance with, rather than the other way around. I think this will be my main contribution, because it just seems like it creates such an unease in the whole room, because other people are observing the whole interaction, and the feeling of having to go up to a table and pay and submit that token can be sort of disarming or a little bit embarrassing. And if it's a little bit more private and done ahead of time, and that it's made to look like it's just part of the dance, that there's not like a difference between, or a less difference between taxi dancers and non-taxi dancers, it can create a bit more cohesion in the whole room and in the group. And also, I think it just feels better when you don't know whether somebody's dancing with you because they're a taxi dancer or not. With this, it was pretty obvious. And, the taxi dancers, they had a sign that they wore, like a little laminated sticker that they wore around their neck. And everybody knew that they're, a taxi dancer. So I think that if it can be done a little bit more subdued and not so in your face, it can help create a more cohesive experience where there's not as much division between these groups of people. Now, professional dancers are professional dancers, and they're always going to be a little bit more choosy, and they're going to stick to their group of people they know. But when it comes to the rest of the community within the milonga, taxi dancers have a good chance of creating something new in the community, meaning that the more dances that older women can get that are really quality, the more overall happiness the group will experience. As I always say, if the women are happy, everyone else will be happy. So I think that is something that I want to promote. So I'm curious about your experience with taxi dancing, and I, also, I don't know, $5 a tanda. Do you think that's a good rate? I mean, I think that if I were to to be a taxi dancer. And I realize that this is also not in the United States, so the prices are different, granted. So this was in Mexico. Things are cheaper, but still, I think $5 a tanda, especially with that high of a demand, I think is a little on the lower side. And perhaps if the taxi dancers were compensated more, and maybe they didn't have to dance as much, that would keep them on the happier side and not so bogged down by the demand. So I'm curious what your opinion is of taxi dancing, if you've had experience with it, what you think is a good model for this experimental type of setup. I think it definitely needs to be explored, and perhaps there needs some dialing in of how it happens. Share with me, send me a message on social media at I am so tango, or you can email me at connect@imsotango.com. And of course, once again, I remind you to join my Facebook group. The link is in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining me for this banter, and we'll continue our banter next week. Until then,